Okay, hi guys. So now before we go on to the challenge question, I'd like to start with a little bit of a warm-up. So this is actually something we've learned previously, right, in our lesson 5. So if you guys have forgotten about it, I do encourage everybody to revise a little bit. Okay, so now let's say that Joanna, Nicole, and Chan Cheng are standing in a row. Okay, so imagine just before any conditions, let's say I only have these 3 kids standing in a row, right? That means what I need to decide on is, okay, who to put in the first position, who to put in the second position, and who to put in the third position, because I have 3 kids, yeah? Okay, but now there is a special condition, right? Joanna and Nicole are good friends and therefore must, okay, be together. Alright, so if they must be together, let's think of them as one group. Okay, so think of Joanna and Nicole as one group. So instead of having 3 different slots, I'm only just gonna have 2 different slots, okay? Because we're gonna think of Nicole and Joanna as just like one entity. They come together, they go together, right? Okay, so if we were to think of them as two entities, so Joanna, Nicole, that's one, and then Chan Cheng, that's one, right? Okay, then if I do it my normal way, there are 2 options for me to choose here, 1 option for me to choose here, right? So therefore, the answer must be 2. There are 2 ways of arranging them. Do you think this is correct? Okay, so think about it. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so hopefully you guys agree that it's not correct. Okay, why? Why is it not correct? Because here arrangement matters, right? What does it mean by arrangement matters? Okay, let's say that this is Joanna and this is Nicole. If arrangement matters, having Joanna on the right and Nicole on the left is going to be different from having Nicole on the right and Joanna on the left. So within each group, there are 2 possible arrangements, right? So within this Nicole-Joanna pair, there are actually 2 possible arrangements. Therefore, we need to multiply by another 2. So what does it mean? So it means that at the end, okay, when you tell me that there are 2 ways of arranging the group and Chan Cheng, I need to multiply another 2. Why I need to multiply another 2? Because within the group itself, there are another 2 possible arrangements. Okay, so therefore, in fact, in total, right, there should be 4 possible ways. Okay, so if you don't believe me, we can try listing them out. Okay, so let's say if I start with just Joanna, Nicole like that, then you have Chan Cheng, right? Or you can have Chan Cheng, then you can have Joanna, Nicole, right? But this is going to be different from having Nicole, then Joanna, and then Chan Cheng. And it's also going to be different from having Chan Cheng, then Nicole, Joanna, right? Okay, so therefore, right guys, when you have a pair, you can swap their positions. When you swap their positions, you times 2. Why? Because in each group, there are 2 possible arrangements. Okay, then now let's take a look. Alright, so over here, okay, Ali, Bala, Charles, Dan, and Ella are standing side by side in a line to take a photo. If Ali and Bala must stand together and Dan is at the furthest left, what are the different arrangements? How many different arrangements are there? Right? Okay, so you think about it. So if there are 5 kids, right? Okay, there must be, alright, 5 blanks. So 5 slots for them to stand on. Okay, and Dan must be at the furthest left, right? So this is something that I know that is definite. Okay, so in that case, Dan must be over here, right? So there is no other answer for Dan. Alright, so that means I'm left with 4 slots, right? Who am I left with? I'm left with Ali, Bala, right? Charles, and Ella. So I'm left with 4 children. But, okay, another condition. Ali and Bala must stand together. So that means that Ali and Bala are in fact one group. So think of them as one entity. So if I think of them as one group and one entity, then I don't look at them separately. If I don't look at them separately, there's only basically 3 options for me to, arrange, right? So there are only 3 options for me to arrange. It should be 3 times 2 times 1. Yeah? So 3 times 2 times 1, in this case, there are 6. So let's say in your Ali plus Bala pair, there are 6 ways to arrange all the kids. But remember, within the pair, can I swap them? Yes, I can. So within the pair, I can swap Ali and Bala, meaning that instead of having Ali plus Bala, I can have Bala on the left and Ali on the right. Okay? So if that is the case, it doesn't matter, right? Because we are still looking at them as a group. So the answer should still be the same. There should still be 6 ways. But is the red 6 ways and the blue 6 ways, are they the same? No, they are not, right? Why? Because arrangement matters over here, where Bala stands matters. Therefore, these two are different, So in that case, your answer should be 6 plus 6. Alright, so or a different way you all can think about it is, 6, then you times 2 at the back. Why times 2? Because within the Ali and Bala pair, there are 2 possible arrangements. Alright, so in that case, the answer here is just 12 ways. Alright, so once you understand this concept of pairing, we are going to try the challenge. So in that case, let's take a closer look at the challenge. So Mr. Green buys 4 cinema tickets for himself, right? His wife and their best friends, Mr. and Mrs. White. Mrs. Green is a rather large lady who must sit on a wider aisle seat. In the interest of marital harmony, each husband must sit next to his wife. The tickets are for the seats A1, A2, A3, and A4, as shown on the plan below. In how many ways can Mr. Green allocate the tickets? Alright, so guys, I hope that, most of you guys should have gone to the cinemas before. If you haven't seen your parents order tickets online, I think you can ask them to show you. You get something like that. You get a seating arrangement. And you can pick, right, which seats you would like to choose. So let's say that these 4 seats are chosen. A1, A2, A3, and A4, right? So in how many ways can Mr. Green allocate the tickets? So who are the 4 people who are going to be sitting in this movie? The 4 people are, right, Mr. Green, Mrs. Green, Mr. White, and Mrs. White, right? These 4 people. So guys, are there anyone that we know, must be in certain positions? Are there any definites? Right? So remember, we have this clue over here, right? So based on this clue, do you guys know where we can put Mrs. Green? Yes. So hopefully you guys have caught on. Alright, so since Mrs. Green must sit in a wider aisle seat, the only place we can put Mrs. Green is A1. So if Mrs. Green is in A1, do you guys know who is in A2? Yeah, Mr. Green, right? Why? Because each husband must sit next to his wife. So therefore, this must be Mr. Green. So for these 2 people, their positions are fixed. Because Mrs. Green cannot sit in A2. She can only sit in A1. So if this is 100% Mrs. Green, that means Mr. Green must sit next to her in A2. Alright, then what about Mrs. and Mrs. White? Mr. and Mrs. White, there are no restrictions for the 2 of them. So they are sitting in A3, A4. Alright, but do we know, who is in A3, who is in A4? We don't, right? But we do a simple multiplication. A3, I should have 2 options. A4, I will have 1. Alright, So therefore, how many ways can Mr. Green allocate the tickets? Just 2. Because they are fixed. If they are fixed, right, we don't have to look at them. We only look at the parts that we are not sure of, which is A3, A4. And there are 2 options of arranging them in A3 and A4. Therefore, the answer is 2. Okay, so now let's go to the second part. Alright guys, so now instead of just having the 2 Mr. and Mrs. Green and Mr. and Mrs. White, now we have Mr. and Mrs. Brown. So again, it is decided that every husband must sit next to his wife and Mrs. Green must sit at the end of a row. So this time, Mr. Green bought the following tickets. Okay, how many ways can Mr. Green allocate the tickets? Same idea, where can Mr. and Mrs. Green go? So you realize that again, they only have one option, right? Mrs. Green must be in A1 and Mr. Green must be next to her. So now the debate is, okay, this 4 seats. So we don't know who is sitting where. Let me ask you guys. Guys, since I have 4 people left, right? Mr. White and Mrs. White. Oh, let me write it like that. Mr. White and Mrs. White. I also have Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown, right? So these are the 4 people I have left. Can I do this? I have 4 people. I want to arrange them 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Because I have 4 people, I pick 1, 3 pick 1, 2 pick 1, 1. What do you think? Something is not right. Yes, very good. Okay, so what exactly is the problem over here? Alright guys, so the problem over here is that, okay, if we do this, okay, there is a possibility that the husband and wife might not necessarily be sitting next to one another. Okay, so therefore, alright guys, the way to go about this is to think of it again as a pair. Very good. Okay, so think of it as a pair. Alright, so if it's a pair over here, right? Okay, Mr. and Mrs. White, they are one pair. They must go together. Mr. and Mrs. Brown, they are one pair. They must go together. So instead of having 4 different options, actually you only have 2. Okay, because they go as a group as one entity, right? Okay, so therefore, I should only have 2 options here. It's either group white or group brown, and I have 1. But remember, within each pair, there are 2 possible arrangements, right? It can be a Mr. White, Mrs. White, or it can be Mrs. White, Mr. White, right? Okay, they can swap places. Therefore, you need to multiply a 2, okay, for Mr. and Mrs. White, and you need to multiply a 2 for Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Okay, why do you need to multiply 2 for each of them? Because position matters. Alright, when you multiply 1, 2 is only for one pair. There are 2 pairs, so you need to multiply 2 twice. Therefore, there are only 8 different ways. If you don't believe me, try listing it out. Okay, how can you arrange Mr. and Mrs. White and Mr. and Mrs. Brown? Alright, so once you understand this part, okay, we can go to the last part. Now, okay, instead of buying in one row, Mr. Green bought the following tickets. So I'm going to just draw it out over here. Okay, so he bought A1, A2, A3, and A4, as well as B1 and B2. Okay, so now guys, do you realize that Mr. and Mrs. Green finally have options? They are no longer stuck at A1 and A2, right? So guys, where can Mr. and Mrs. Green go now? Very good. Okay, so you all probably realized, Teacher Ing, Mrs. Green can either be at A1 or B1, right? Either or. And Mr. Green can either be at A2 or B2. So how many options is that? Okay, so for the Greens, they now have two options. Why two options? They are either at, okay, B1, B2, or A1, A2. Right? So there are two options for them. Okay? So now that we've decided on them, right, we can look at the others, right? So we can look at the remaining other two pairs, which is Mr. and Mrs. White and Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Let me just quickly scribble that down so you all remember. And Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Okay, so to visualize this, right, again, let's imagine. Imagine that Mr. and Mrs. Green decided to choose a different scenery and they pick B1 and B2. Okay, so in that case, guys, can you tell me how many ways are there to arrange Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Mr. and Mrs. White in the remaining A1 to A4? Do you realize it is pretty much the same as our previous question? Yes, right? You group them together. There are two groups, right? Two groups. Each group, you swap position, multiply by 2. Okay, so if Mr. and Mrs. Green are in B1, B2, there are 8 ways of arranging. Similarly, if they are at A1, A2, there are 8 ways of arranging. Alright, so therefore, how many ways of arranging are there? Okay, so you can just take 8 times 2. Why 8 times 2? Because Mr. and Mrs. Green have 2 ways of arranging themselves. They can either be at A1, A2 or B1, B2. Okay, so therefore answer is 16. So if you guys are wondering, Teacher Ing, why is there only 2? Why can't Mrs. and Mr. Green swap places? Y'all think about it. Can they swap places? No, right? They can't swap places. Why? Because Mrs. Green must always be in the aisle seat. Okay, so maybe if I write it like that, it's easier to understand. Mrs. Green must always be in the aisle seat. Okay, and Mr. Green must always be to her right side. Okay, there is only this arrangement. There's no other possible arrangements. Alright, so therefore, okay, the answer is 16. Alright, so I hope that this video is helpful to you guys. Alright, to understand the approach to these kind of questions.